All right, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is John Farrell. I'm education coordinator here at Philipse Manor Hall, and we're very excited because this is the first time that we are doing a live stream, and we're doing an encore presentation of a lecture that we had just a couple weeks ago before the holiday, given by our own Sarah Wassberg Johnson. So thanks for joining us again for this encore presentation. And Sarah's going to be available afterwards to answer questions live. She's also here. We can answer questions in the chat if there's anything that you'd like to go over during the presentation. We can do that. But we'll be available. Sarah will be available for question and answer after the presentation. So thanks for coming in, Sarah. Sarah is Education and Programs Director here at Philipse Manor Hall State Historic Site, and she has a master's degree in public history from the University at Albany. That's at Albany, not of Albany, right, Sarah?
Sure.
Okay, the University at Albany, and in her spare time, researches food history, so pretty apropos for the time. So anything you'd like to say before we get rolling, Sarah?
Yeah, this is a really fun talk to do the first time around, and a number of people were sad that they couldn't make it. So I'm excited to share the rebroadcast and answer any questions that anybody might have.
All right. Well, thanks for coming back. And like I said, any questions you have, drop it in the chat, and we'll either answer there or live via video, via live stream after the presentation. All right. So let's get it started.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today in person and online. My name is Sarah Wassberg Johnson. I'm the Education and Programs Manager here at Philipse Manor Hall State Historic Site. In honor of the big holiday feast many of us had on Thursday, and for the impending holiday season, including St. Nicholas Day next week, I thought we would take some time this weekend to discuss the history behind some of our favorite holiday foods and some connections to colonial New York. So my talk is called Sugar and Spice, A Global History. So first we're going to talk about the everything nice part. In the Western world, we most often associate sugar and spice with celebrating the holidays. As I said, many of us just got done with Thanksgiving dinner a few days ago, and so how many people had pumpkin pie? Oh, a couple of you. If you did, you can thank the Spice Islands for your pie as much as indigenous people for creating pumpkins, but we'll get to that in a minute. So spices are a huge category, but typically when we think of spices in the US, we think of pumpkin spice or apple pie spice, or as they say in the UK, mixed spice. And we think of the sweet spices. So cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, allspice, mace, and maybe even cardamom. They show up at holiday treats like gingerbread, fruitcake, spice cake, pumpkin and apple pie, mincemeat cookies, and mulled wine and cider. But these spices are not native to Europe or the United States. So where are they from? First, let's define what is a spice. Spices typically consist of seeds, fruit, bark, or roots of strongly flavored plants. Herbs are typically the leaves and sometimes the stems of strongly flavored plants. And spices are used all over the world, but are usually derived from locally available plants. So I thought I'd give a little overview about where some of our most familiar spices are native to. Although we typically think of spices as coming from the Far East, Europe does have a number of native spices, including caraway, coriander, anise, orris, which is the root of iris plants, sumac, mustard, dill seed, juniper, celery seed, and horseradish. Of these, caraway, coriander, and anise were the spices used most often in European sweets. Southeast Asia is home to the bulk of the world's spices, including cinnamon, pepper, ginger, cloves, cardamom, turmeric, fenugreek, saffron, star anise, and nutmeg and mace. Sugar is also native to Southeast Asia, and until the 17th century was considered more of a spice than a main ingredient. Africa is home to a number of native spices, including grains of paradise, cumin, korarima, Iden fruit, and calabash nutmeg. But of these, only grains of paradise and cumin are widely known outside of Africa. And there are some native spices to the New World, basically North and South America and the Caribbean. And some of them are pretty big and influential ones. Allspice being the main spice that we're familiar with, but also vanilla, cacao, and chilies, including cayenne. So I thought we would take a look at some of the more popular holiday spices in alphabetical order for ease of everybody's use. And I'm just going to give a little quick overview. So allspice is native to the Greater Antilles and southern Mexico and Central America. It gets its name around 1621 when the English encounter it in the Caribbean, and they call it allspice because it tastes like a bunch of spices that they are familiar with all mixed together. It's used primarily it's an ingredient in Jamaican jerk chicken, but allspice is most often used in spice mixes for holiday treats. The spice itself is the dried berry of the allspice plant. Black pepper is native to the Malabar coast of western India, and it was well known in the ancient world along with its cousin, long pepper. Pepper is the dried seed of the pepper tree, and although it has multiple uses, Northern Europeans did use it in sweets, including gingerbread and spice cookies. Europeans who encountered chilies in Mexico in the 16th century called them peppers, after the hottest spice they knew up until that point, which was black pepper. Cinnamon dates back to antiquity and is native to Southeast Asia. The spice is actually the bark of the cinnamon tree, and there are several varieties, but classical peoples valued Cinnamonum verum, or true cinnamon, the most, which is native to Sri Lanka as well as parts of India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. The cinnamon we eat most often in the US is Cinnamonum cassia, which is native to China, and there's also a variant cassia in Vietnam. Cinnamon is probably the most popular spice in the United States after black pepper and is used extensively in holiday desserts. Clove is native to the Maluku Islands in Southeast Asia, which is today part of Indonesia. The spice is the dried flower buds of the clove plant, and they are harvested before the flowers bloom. Clove dates back to the ancient world, and historically its uses were primarily medicinal, as clove oil has numbing properties. Clove is most often used in sweet desserts and mulling spices, but it is also used to flavor meats, most notably ham. Ginger is perhaps one of the most ancient spices. It is native to Southeast Asia, but proliferated throughout Asia in prehistory and quickly spread to the ancient Mediterranean. The spice comes from the root or rhizome of the flowering plant. It is used extensively in savory dishes in Asia, but is typically a dessert spice in Europe and the West. Its importation to the Caribbean in the 17th century led to its flourishing there, and it became a major export crop before the introduction of slave labor made sugar more lucrative. Nutmeg was one of the most rare and valuable spices in history. Native to the Banda Islands, which is a tiny sub-chain of the Maluku Islands in Indonesia, nutmeg actually produces two spices, the nut, which is the nutmeg, and also the red outer husk of the nut, which is mace. Nutmeg was highly valued by Europeans who ate so much of it that they discovered the effects of nutmeg intoxication, which is a real thing, but you have to eat way more of it than people typically do today. Nutmeg also became a major source of conflict in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's used primarily in sweets, but also to flavor custard and cream dishes like cream spinach, pureed squash, as well as meats. Mace was used similarly, but surprising to some people, it is often also a primary ingredient in spiced sausages. And last, but certainly not least, sugar is native to Southeast Asia, perhaps Guinea, but it has been cultivated in India since prehistory. Sugar is derived from the juice of the sugarcane, a type of grass, and it was introduced to Northern Europe by Arabs during the medieval period, resulting in a culinary renaissance. It was used primarily in desserts, but was also used to sweeten beverages and meats. Extraordinarily expensive, it was historically used more as a spice, but the development of European plantations in Southeast Asia and the Caribbean led to its more extensive use. Okay, don't mind the puns in my headers. Some of the spices from Southeast Asia were known in the ancient world, notably cinnamon, ginger, and pepper. And these spices traveled via ancient trade routes over land and across the Indian Ocean. The Romans spoke often of the cinnamon country, which they thought was located in present-day Somalia, but was in fact located in Sri Lanka. The Arab traders they worked with may have hidden the locations of these spices as trade secrets to protect their businesses. Ancient Rome also knew two competing peppers, the long pepper and what we know today as black pepper. Although long pepper has a stronger flavor, black pepper eventually won out as the primary spice in the Mediterranean and Northern Europe. These spices show up in Roman cooking texts, including the famous Art of Cooking by Epicurus. Sugar was also known in the ancient world, with records of it dating to the 1st century, although primarily in medicinal texts. Persians encountered it in India, and the Muslim world began cultivating sugar on the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and the Mediterranean in the 9th and 10th centuries. The development of the Silk Road, or the trade routes between Asia and the Middle East, in the 2nd century BCE also helped spur the spice trade. Most spices were dried and therefore very lightweight. Their high value in faraway places where they were not able to be cultivated made them a popular trade item. Spices might exchange hands numerous times, getting more expensive each time, before reaching their final destinations in the kitchens of the wealthy. Sugar was not typically used as a sweetener in the ancient world, as it was just too expensive. Europeans relied on honey and fruit, sometimes cooking fruit into syrups like pomegranate molasses. In addition to locally available sweet spices like anise, coriander, caraway, and bay leaf, people also used wine, rose water, and orange blossom water as flavorings for breads, cakes, puddings, and cookies. Ginger, cinnamon, saffron, and black pepper were used in both sweet and savory applications. By the time of the Crusades, Europe had adopted a lot from the from the Arab world, including sugar and spices. Expensive foreign spices became primary ingredients in plague cures. And some, such as pepper, were thought to be potent aphrodisiacs. But most spices were used to flavor foods, not, as many have said, to cover up the taste of bad meat, because why would you want to waste spices worth more than their weight in gold on rotting meat? Not super logical. Instead, spices were used a lot like we use them today, which is as flavor agents. Spices were also extremely fashionable, as only the wealthiest and most elite were able to afford them on a regular basis. In fact, their exclusive nature is what led them to be used most often in holiday celebrations. And in medieval Europe, few holiday celebrations were larger than Christmas, giving us a number of holiday treats we still eat today, including gingerbread and fruitcake. At the heart of this spice empire was Venice. It was a major player and connector between the Arab world and Europe. It had close trade ties with Byzantium, which was later known as Constantinople and today Istanbul, and later Egypt and the Middle East. Venice had a virtual monopoly on the spice trade in Europe, and the trade brought immense wealth to the city-state. In addition to spices and sugar from the Arab states, Venice also imported other foods that could not be typically cultivated in Northern Europe, including almonds, raisins, and currants, and citrus fruits like oranges and lemons. As Europe entered the Renaissance era, sugar, spices, and imported fruits and nuts that had been the hallmarks of wealth and influence for hundreds of years continued to be popular ingredients for holiday cooking, especially desserts. One Venetian would have an outsized influence on Europe's connection to the rest of the world. This image is from Le Livre des Merveilles de Marco Polo, which directly translated is the Book of Marvels of Marco Polo, or as it is typically known in English, the Travels of Marco Polo. Marco Polo was a Venetian explorer who traveled the Silk Road between 1712 and 1795. He was only 17 years old when he left with his trader, father, and uncle. He kept records of his journey and published it on his return in 1298 with the title Description of the World. But his book was actually considered a work of fiction by most Europeans at the time. After his death, the truth of it became known, and it had immense impact on subsequent explorers. In this book illustration from the 1410 version, Indian workers are harvesting black pepper, and an Arab trader gives it a sniff for freshness. By the 15th century, Europeans were thoroughly addicted to both spices and sugar. In particular, cloves and especially nutmeg were prized for their strong flavors. Demand for both was high. In the early 1400s, led by Prince Henry the Navigator, Portugal improved its sailing technology and began exploring between Portugal and West Africa. By 1430, they had claimed the Atlantic islands of Madeira, the Canary Islands, the Azores, and had opened trade relations with West Africa. By the mid-1400s, with financial backing from Genoa, which was Venice's chief rival, Portugal began producing sugar on the island of Madeira. Like Mediterranean and North African sugar plantations, sugar production in Madeira used slave labor. In 1453, Constantinople, formerly Byzantium, fell to the Ottoman Empire. Suddenly, the steady flow of spices and the accompanying huge profit margins through Venice tightened dramatically. Portugal had honed its sail technology in the early 1400s by exploring the coast of Africa and Atlantic islands like Madeira and the Canary Islands. And fueled by sugar profits, the demand for spices, and its own sailing expertise, Portugal embarked on an effort to bypass Arab traders in the Middle East and get to Asia on their own. This illustration from the early 17th century in Italy shows a number of spices and confections displayed in glass jars on top of labeled wooden drawers. And then we have a shopkeeper grinding spice with a mortar and pestle, with scales and a china jar in the foreground. Okay. In 1488, Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias successfully navigated the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, setting the precedent for what would become the most effective route to Asia by sea. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor who cut his navigational teeth on the Madeira sugar trade and who married a sugar grower's daughter there, was unable to convince the Portuguese to fund his exploratory journey west. So he turned to Spain, who, jealous of Portugal's sugar profits, agreed to fund the journey. In 1492, he reached what he thought was India. He had, in fact, discovered a new world entirely, a region of the world completely unknown to Europeans. He brought cacao back with him, along with the concept that the Taino people he met would be easily subjugated, and that the island he discovered would be perfect for growing sugar. Although he died before he could see that plan to fruition, his son was one of the first to establish a sugar plantation with enslaved Taino labor on Jamaica in 1509. Jamaica is also home to allspice, although that would not be encountered by Europeans until the 1620s. In 1497, Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama began the first of several voyages from Portugal to India, using Bartolomeu Dias's route around the Cape of Good Hope. Over the course of 3 voyages, da Gama fought with Muslim traders and established a Portuguese presence in India. Thanks to da Gama, the Arab and Muslim hold on the European spice trade was weakening. Portuguese navigator Ferdinand Magellan gained experience on the Portugal-India trade. Like his predecessor Christopher Columbus, Magellan was certain that there was a western route to the Spice Islands. Like Columbus, he was turned down by the Portuguese monarchy. So in 1517, he renounced his nationality and went to Spain. 2 years later, in 1519, in exchange for the promise of riches and a route unknown to the Portuguese, Spanish King Charles I granted his wish. Magellan successfully navigated the straits between South America and Antarctica that would later be named for him. He named the ocean he encountered on the other side Pacifico because it seemed much calmer to him than the stormy waters of the straits. After an agonizingly long voyage across the largest ocean in the world, Magellan and his crew reached the Philippines. He was killed in a local conflict, but while Magellan never made it to the Spice Islands, his crew did. Of the 5 vessels and 200-plus crew who left Spain in 1517, only 18 men and 1 ship, heavy with spices, returned to Spain in 1522, having proved beyond a doubt that the earth was round and that the western route to the Spice Islands did exist. Despite Magellan's discovery, the western route remained far more dangerous and less profitable than the eastern route. The Portuguese were well on their way to cutting out the middlemen, Muslim traders, entirely. King Manuel I of Portugal was invested in beating the Spanish to Southeast Asia. In 1510, the Portuguese captured the Indian port city of Goa, and in 1511, they captured the port city of Malacca, the main trade port in the Maluku Islands, also known as the Spice Islands. The Maluku Islands are a small chain located in present-day Indonesia. Also known as the Moluccas, historically they were known as the Spice Islands. The Maluku Islands were once the only place in the world where cloves and nutmeg grew. In fact, while cloves were present throughout the Moluccas, nutmeg and mace, which come from the same plant, were once native only to the tiny Banda Islands, an even smaller subset of the Maluku Islands. Prior to the Portuguese takeover in 1511, the port city of Malacca was the major trading port between China and India, with a hugely diverse community of traders, including those from the Arabian Peninsula, Middle East, India, Siam, Java, and China. According to an early Portuguese resident, as many as 84 dialects were spoken in Malacca. The 1511 takeover was made easier by the fact that Malacca had no fortifications to speak of, and the forces amassed by the Sultan of Malay were largely ineffective against the Portuguese fleet. Upon the conquest of the city, the Portuguese built a huge stone fort and encouraged trade to continue. Traders who had supported the Portuguese takeover were happy to resume business as usual. From Malacca, the Portuguese found Banda Island and set up trade relations. Although they were never able to establish a monopoly on trade, they were able to bypass Muslim traders and get spices straight from the source, improving both individual and state fortunes. This painting from 1614 depicts an unknown eastern port, but it does showcase many ships of many nationalities, including European nationalities, coming into trade. By the 1520s, Portugal was well on its way as a major power in Southeast Asia. They had beat the Spanish to the Spice Islands and India, but back home in Europe, geopolitics were getting complicated. The Portuguese had used the Netherlands as one of their main access points to the markets of Northern Europe, but war was on the horizon. The 1500s brought the European wars of religion, or wars of Reformation. By the 1560s, the Netherlands had revolted against their Catholic Spanish rulers in what would be known as the Dutch Revolt, or the 80 Years' War. In the 1580s, Portugal had allied with Spain in the Iberian Union, but when Philip II of Spain cut the Netherlands off from the Lisbon spice markets, the Dutch decided to take matters into their own hands. Dating back to the mid-1400s, Portugal and Spain, with authority from the Pope, had divided the world essentially in half. Maritime law at the time supported mare clausum, or closed seas, access to which were governed by a single entity. In this case, Portugal and Spain had divvied up the world between them, with Portugal controlling the southern Atlantic and Indian Oceans, and Spain, through Magellan, claiming the rest of the Atlantic and the Pacific. Other European nations, particularly the Dutch, French, and English, were not happy with this arrangement. And after a 1595 visit to the Portuguese-controlled Spice Islands, the Dutch declared war on the Portuguese by attacking most of their colonial holdings. Already at war with the Spanish, they also attacked Spanish colonial holdings in the Philippines. The major backer behind most of these attacks was the newly formed Dutch East India Company, or VOC. Chartered in 1602 with a 21-year monopoly on the Asia trade, the VOC operated essentially as a small country. Able to establish colonies, mint currencies, and start wars, the VOC lost no time in doing all of those things. In 1603, it captured a heavily laden Portuguese ship, and the international scandal charged the Dutch with violating Portugal's control of the seas via mare clausum. In retort, the Dutch jurist Hugo Grotius argued in favor of what he called mare liberum, or the free seas, giving the Dutch ideological justification for its actions in war and trade. One of their first targets were the Portuguese-held Spice Islands. Dutch traders had visited the Banda Islands in the Moluccas in 1599, but the locals resisted giving the Dutch a trade monopoly, because of course, why would they? They were trading with all kinds of people. So in 1609, the Dutch conquered the island by force, massacring nearly 3,000 people and enslaving another 1,700. The Bandanese resistance finally ended in 1621, and the remaining 1,000 people were deported from the island. The Dutch had their first monopoly. The world's entire nutmeg and mace trade was now under their control. That year, in 1621, the Dutch established a plantation system on Banda Island to increase yields of nutmeg and mace. Having killed or removed almost the entire indigenous population of the islands, they imported African and Indonesian slaves to work on the plantations. From there, the Dutch East India Company engaged in a number of conflicts with local powers throughout Indonesia, eventually controlling almost the entire island chain by the early 1700s. This gave them access to the production of cloves and black pepper, along with a monopoly on nutmeg and mace. They were headquartered in Batavia and Java. This illustration from Dutch traveler Wouter Schouten shows the size and prevalence of Dutch ships in the Malacca harbor, as well as the presence of native Asian and even Arab ships. The main island in the Banda chain, called Nira, was shifted to plantation culture and fortified against attacks from other European powers. You can also see how small it is. These islands are really tiny, so to think that the world's entire nutmeg and mace production was coming from this one tiny place, you could see why the Dutch wanted to control it. While the Dutch East India Company fought to control other spice islands, including setting up their administrative headquarters in Batavia, which is pictured here, the Dutch West India Company was established in 1621 with a monopoly on trade in the Western Hemisphere. They had been established based on the explorations of English navigator Henry Hudson, who had been hired by the Dutch East India Company to find a northern route to the Spice Islands. Instead, he went west and encountered North America in 1609. His discovery was confirmed by Dutch cartographer Adrian Block in 1613-14, and although the Dutch West India Company also had a monopoly on trade in the West, unlike the VOC, it was not able to use military troops or mint coins. Although we most often associate the Dutch West India Company with the colony of New Netherland, which is today New York, we were actually its least successful colony. Another picture of Henry Hudson there. Instead, the company turned to the Caribbean, where sugar production had begun as early as the 1500s. The Portuguese, with their experience in sugar production on Madeira, had early success in the 1550s off the coast of their colony of Brazil. But the Dutch-Portuguese War changed things. The Dutch West India Company successfully took Brazil from the Portuguese in 1624, welcoming Sephardic Jews escaping the Spanish Inquisition and expanding plantation culture. But they lost it again in 1654, and a decade later, they lost New Netherland to the English. Unable to hold large colonies, the Dutch West India Company turned instead to the West African slave trade and privateering. Curaçao became its Caribbean headquarters for the Atlantic slave trade, which fueled the rise of sugar plantations throughout the Caribbean. The English, long cut out of the spice trade, began investing in the sugar trade in the Caribbean, establishing plantation culture in Jamaica and Barbados, fueled by slave labor. As the Portuguese had found in Madeira, sugar production was incredibly labor-intensive. And while massive profits could be made from sugar produced with enslaved labor, equally large profits could be made from the slave trade. The Philipse family, starting in 1685, entered the slave trade. By 1700, they had established a sugar plantation on Barbados. Trade in enslaved people to sugar plantations in the Caribbean formed the bulk of their wealth. Why was the slave trade so lucrative? Because sugar production had an extremely high mortality rate. So let's take a look at how sugar was made. These images are from 1823 by British artist William Clark and depict the stages of sugar production on the island of Antigua. Here we see enslaved people staking and digging holes to plant sugarcane. Labor was divided by age and strength, but not by gender. Sugarcane was planted in these holes and often covered with manure, carried in by hand. When fully grown, sugarcane, which is a type of grass, was harvested by machete and bundled and sent to the grinder. Cutters had to bend low to cut the cane near the ground, using razor-sharp machetes to cut through the extremely tough canes. It was very difficult work. The cane was then transported to wind-powered grinding mills, which pulled the cane through stone grinders. The juice was extracted and collected, but there were few safety precautions, and workers were often injured. The juice was then transported to the boiling house, where fires were kept going day and night. Inside, the cane juice was boiled multiple times before the sugar crystallized and was dried. And you can see you have the boiling pots on the left there, and then one enslaved worker is spooning the syrup into a funnel, which is then bring it into these basically big platforms to be dried and crystallized. The sugar cane was then dried, drained of molasses, and cured. So this is the curing house and stills. For very fine white sugar, the product would be boiled and cured multiple times. But the byproduct, which was molasses, was distilled into rum. Rum production was almost as lucrative as sugar, and rum was used extensively in the slave trade as both currency and trade gift. Once the sugar was fully cured, it was packed into watertight hogsheads and shipped north to the American colonies or to Europe. Molasses and rum were also shipped in barrels, and molasses became an important source of cheap sweetener for the lower classes. As sugar and rum were shipped north to the colonies, wheat was shipped south. The Philipse family's wealth and that of their New York compatriots was intimately tied to the Caribbean. Tenant farmer raised wheat, fed planter and slave alike in the Caribbean, where all arable land was given to sugar production and where wheat grew poorly. That money, in turn, was invested into slave trade voyages, where people were kidnapped and sold in Africa and brought to the Caribbean for forced labor. Work on sugar plantations was some of the hardest and most deadly labor in the colonies. The mortality rate on some of the sugar islands was so high that the enslaved population was replaced entirely every few years. But the expanded production of sugar made it far more plentiful than it had been a century earlier. And expanded access meant that holiday treats were no longer the purview of only the wealthy. Sugar and spices were primary ingredients in the confections of the medieval ultra-rich. Foods made to celebrate the holiday season, which in the medieval liturgical calendar lasted as early as the St. Nicholas Day feast on December 6th to Twelfth Night on January 6th, were rich in expensive imported ingredients like sugar, sweet spices, and imported nuts and fruits. Although not all of those historical treats have survived to present day, a lot of them have. Notably, fruitcake, gingerbread, mincemeat, although it no longer contains meat, mulled wine, saffron buns, and marzipan. In the Dutch colony of New Netherland, St. Nicholas Day was a much larger holiday than Christmas. Gingerbread, or speculoos, were special treats from Sinterklaas. And the American word cookie comes from the Dutch word koekje, first printed in New York in 1703. Excuse me. Another Dutch treat rich with spices and raisins were oliebollen, or special round fried donuts. These were generally a treat for New Year's Day. And here we have a 19th century depiction of New Year's Day in New Amsterdam. And this little boy in the center, I don't know if you can see him in the black and brown, has some oliebollen and gingerbread under his arm. British America had unique access to sugar and molasses thanks to the Caribbean sugar trade. Many Dutch and medieval influences remained in British households, particularly in New York. Combined with traditional British desserts like plum pudding, Queen's cake, Shrewsbury cakes, and pound cake, British colonists also used indigenous ingredients to develop uniquely American foods like pumpkin pie, American-style apple pie, and Indian pudding, which is a baked or boiled mixture of cornmeal, molasses, and spices. Access to sugar and spices were not the only predictors of wealth. Until the mid-19th century, fine baking was actually quite difficult. Pies were fairly easy and could be done in a Dutch oven, but cakes, and especially cookies, required built-in bake ovens and a relatively high level of skill, especially when working with expensive ingredients. In most households, colonial households of means, the baker was enslaved. An enslaved baker could not leave for higher pay or more prestigious household. Enslaved labor was also far cheaper to employ than, say, a French chef. Large holiday meals were most usually produced by enslaved kitchen staff and often served by enslaved servants. And those holiday foods that everyone loves were usually not made, particularly the more expensive or delicate ones were generally not made by ordinary people. Which makes our holiday food traditions a little bittersweet. As Europeans dominated the sugar and spice trades, they also spread plantation culture across Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and North and South America, increasing production of formerly scarce resources. The use of enslaved labor not only increased supply, but also lowered costs. It was not until the mid-19th century that improved technology reduced reliance on enslaved labor. But in some parts of the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, colonial era plantation culture continued into the 20th century, notably in Dutch-controlled Southeast Asia. Today, we can be grateful for the technological advancements that mean we can enjoy our sweet and spiced holidays treats without enslaved labor, but we still have to acknowledge the history of where these foods come from.
All right. Well, we're back. Very interesting stuff there. So that was again shown just a couple weeks ago here at Philipse Manor Hall. And if anyone in the chat has any questions, now is the time. But Sarah, while we wait for the chat to fill up, I have a question or two for you.
Great.
So I was curious. You had mentioned gingerbread in there as one of the holiday treats, and I understand because I attended another very informative lecture here at Philipse Manor Hall last year about the history of gingerbread, that the recipe used to be much different from what we eat now. So can you talk a little bit about how palates have changed over time? People's palates have changed?
Yeah, so one of the earliest recipes for gingerbread dates to the 13th century. And it combines honey with breadcrumbs and ginger. It's very strong flavored. And I think that is really the biggest difference between what historical people ate and what we eat today, is that people in the past were much more used in many instances to stronger flavors, particularly if you look at the medieval period and really up until the 18th century. The use of spice was quite heavy-handed compared to what we do now, in large part because spice was so closely associated with wealth. For instance, it's not uncommon to see historical recipes, particularly for cakes, and in particular fruit cakes, which are like the ancestors, the descendants of medieval great cakes, calling for an entire nutmeg. So a whole nutmeg to be grated and added to a single cake. Now, those cakes are much larger than typically what we consider modern cakes. But fresh nutmeg is very strongly flavored compared to what most people are used to, the pre-ground dried stuff you get in a little jar, right? And so you basically get these very strong spice flavors in a lot of historic foods that we are not typically used to today, particularly in the United States.
But now, you mentioned strongly flavored and incorporating a lot of heavy spices. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that people are not favoring sweet flavors? Is it not generally available? I know you talk about how the use of enslaved labor brings down the cost of sugar. So are people using a lot of spices because they can't afford sugar? How are they sweetening things without sugar? And how does that impact the use of spice?
Yeah, so before we get the Caribbean slave trade and sugar plantations in the Caribbean, sugar was much more sparingly used. It was used almost as if it were a spice. And so once sugar sort of comes onto markets more broadly, right? It's more available, it becomes less expensive. Then sort of the quantity of sugar that you have access to is your determinant of wealth. So historical people did use other sweeteners, particularly in Europe. Honey was very popular, but honey, it's quite difficult to scale honey up significantly. And so that's one of the reasons why sugar becomes so popular, is because honey is just less available. And also honey is quite strongly flavored in and of itself. And that, I think, was one of the advantages of particularly the refined white sugar, is that refined white sugar does not have much of a taste besides sweet. less refined sugars and molasses in particular can be very strongly flavored, but refined white sugar is basically just sweetening whatever flavor you're adding it to. And I think that was a big advantage culinarily, is that you could add sugar to fruits or to cakes, and you're not masking the taste of other flavors like happens occasionally with honey.
Scarcity of honey. Weird how history repeats itself. I feel like that. I seem to have read an article lately that that's going to be coming about. But now, how does the common person get these things? Like, how does someone learn about these new exotic spices are coming in? I know if I need to look up how to make something, I have the advantage of the internet. And after I wade through this person's entire life story, I get to the recipe. But when does it come about that these spices are incorporated in cookbooks? Is it quickly after they're brought over? Does it take a long time?
So cookbook history is kind of intimately intertwined with the history of the wealthy. Because of course, most people who are cooking, ordinary people who are cooking, are being taught by relatives, or in the case of professional chefs, there might be an apprenticeship, right? And so you really don't need specific recipes unless you're doing very complicated dishes. And that is typically what's happening in the households of the wealthy, not the households of ordinary people. So a lot of your very first cookbooks are cookbooks for, kings and royalty, emperors, things like that. And that trend sort of continues in the 17th and 18th centuries, even as printing presses make books more accessible. They're still quite expensive. And they're still mostly designed for professionals in large households. So it's interesting, the United States, actually, some of our earliest cookbooks, which is really not until the very late 18th century, we get Amelia Simmons' American Cookery in 1796. That's considered the first truly American cookbook, although European cookbooks were printed in America prior to that. But that one is designed for people without servants in their household, right? And so it's designed more for ordinary people, and that continues to be the trend in the early 19th century as well. But those earlier cookbooks are generally geared towards upper class people with large households to run, where you might need either to train a cook as, the quote unquote lady of the house, or you might need to know other things about how to run a household in addition to recipes, such as how to manage servants, the etiquette of parties and things like that. Those are items that were often included in those early cookbooks. And a bunch of them, this is true also of modern and historical community cookbooks. In particular, as the recipes are typically a lot of dessert recipes or cake recipes. And that is true of some of those early cookbooks as well, because they're it's a little bit more complicated to make cakes in particular, and sort of these fancy dishes that, you might not have learned how to make from your mother or grandmother.
Interesting stuff. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for this evening. But thank you for joining us to do this Encore presentation and a little live Q&A here. And for everyone out there on YouTube, make sure that you visit philipsmanorhall.com to keep an eye on the events we have coming up. Our next lecture in February will be Dr. Shirley Green. That is on February 12th, I believe. And fascinating story of two brothers of color in the American Revolution. It's original research that she's done. Really interesting stuff. I've heard her speak before. So make sure you join us for that on February 12th. I put a link in the chat to the event sign up. And keep an eye on our website and come and visit us. We're here Wednesday to Sunday from 10 to 5.
And I'm just going to put a little plug into, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, please do so. We tend to post our lecture recordings, and we also have fun YouTube shorts that we post from time to time.
All right. Well, subscribe, like, all the things that they say on these YouTube lives. This is our first one, so I'm still getting used to that. I'm sure I'll have some overbearing dubs to go on the next one. But all right, thanks everybody, and hopefully we'll see you soon out here at Philipse Manor Hall.
Good night.